Well, yeah, like there could be, yeah, like sort of a specific element about a thing that you're talking about. Sure. Sure, Jim. At least one of the five senses. Yeah. I mean, this is like how you're so sort of thinking about like perception, like how we take in the world, you know, like through our vision, through our ears, through touch, through like, you know, through taste. What's the other one? Smell. Thank you. And through scent. Yeah, like I think that's a really big one. That's one thing I notice a lot, and we'll talk about it a little bit more about like using details that tap into our full dimensions, right? Like building out a fully three-dimensional world, and not just like only inputting or building our world through one sense. I was sort of thinking about this too, and this is the definition I was going to offer. I think this is, you know, there could be more to be added to it. The working definition of details that I'm going to stick with as we walk through different examples and kind of break down how they're used and not used. The definition of detail that I have is like, it's the fine particulars, the specifics of setting, character, action, events, etc. that both build out the world of your story and reveal something about the inner world, right? It does these two things at once, right? So when you come across details in a poem, in a story, in an essay, you're both getting some information, some specific information, some sensory information about where we are and who the people are in this world, and you're also, just by it being noted compared to any other detail that might be acknowledged, just getting some information about what's important, right? Like what's important to the story, what's important to the character, what's some sort of inner truth, you know, is revealed. Even if we don't quite know what that truth is, we have to read on to find out. Another reason I wanted to talk about like kind of details too is because I remember like when I was in my writing program, we were doing the equivalent of critical essays. I was doing the critical essays through in one semester. I felt like it felt like a big revelation for me at the time. But I remember doing one about the first example we have here on the handout. This it's fiction by Steinbeck, and I remember reading it and being like really finding this world very evocative, right? It felt very vivid. It felt very rich and full to me. I had like when I put the book down, I still felt it, right? Like I felt the feeling of that world. And so the question I was asking when I was trying to write my little craft essay was, you know, well, how did he do it? what do you do to make a world feel that multidimensional? And so I'm just gonna read it. I'm just gonna read the piece, and we'll come back to some of what I was thinking about why. Jody turned back and looked at the side hill where the road from the outside world came down. The hill was washed with lean March sunshine. Silver thistles, blue lupins, and a few poppies bloomed among the sagebrushes. Halfway up the hill, Jody could see Doubletree Mutt, the black dog, digging in a squirrel hole. He paddled for a while and then paused to kick bursts of dirt out between his hind legs. And he dug with an earnestness which belied the knowledge he must have had that no dog had ever caught a squirrel by digging in a hole. Outside, Jody whistled shrilly to the dogs. "Come on up the hill," he commanded. The two dogs waved their tails and ran ahead. Along the roadside, the sage had tender nude tips. Jody tore off some pieces and rubbed them in his hands until the air was filled with the sharp, wild smell. With the rush, the dogs leaped from the road and yapped into the brush after a rabbit. That was the last Jody saw of them, for when they failed to catch the rabbit, they went back home. Jody plodded on up the hill toward the ridge top. When he reached the little cleft where the road came through, the afternoon wind struck him and blew up his hand and ruffled his shirt. He looked down on the light hills, little hills and ridges below, and then out at the huge green Salinas Valley. He could see the white town of Salinas far out in the flat and the flash of its windows under the waning sun. Directly below him, in an oak tree, a crow congress had convened. The tree was black with crows calling all at once. So the thing that felt like a revelation for me, and that I wrote a little essay about, is that I was really struck by how this description was, not leaning hard on kind of abstract words that told me how to feel about it, like beautiful, It kept things in the very concrete world, right? It's not just trees that he's walking by on a hill. It's like silver thistles. It's blue lupins. It's he's walking among these like sagebrush. He's naming things. Like I was starting to think about like the power of like calling things by the right names, right? Calling even if I can't like summon a vision of what a silver thistle is in my head, the name itself evokes something, right? The description is in the name. And the power of choosing right nouns and right verbs and letting the specificity of it, the concreteness, hold the details, rather than like live in this kind of abstraction of trees and beautifulness and so forth, built out a much more memorable world. And just like Jim said, you can see how there's a lot of multi-sensory things going on too, right? Like he's seeing things, but there's also the shrill whistle. You hear his voice. You get the scent of the sage, when he plucks it off, and he can feel and you catch that scent. You have like the wind, like kind of like coming up his sleeve. So he feels that. I feel that when I read this. So this is just like a few paragraphs. But we're getting at this like very full multi-dimensional world. You get the like flash of the colors, like the flash of the white light of the kind of like gleaming in the city on the distance, and you get this, the crows like convening all about, which feels it's both visual. You can picture that tree like leaved with crows, and you can also like hear those cawing, like them cawing at the end. You're existing fully in space, right? And like I just note this is an active scene, right? Like we're not like just plunking, we're not stopping the story, giving a 360-degree paragraph of description, and then continuing on with the story, right? Like he's moving in space. We're following our main character as he and his dogs move from here to there. We're in a narrative scene. We're in a specific moment, in a specific place, at a specific time of day, and so that the details, this vivid quality, the descriptive quality, is like knit into the plot, right? As opposed to being that thing that you break your story up to, I don't know, give a little flourish of a sunset and then continue on your way, right? So. I think there are some important lessons from there. What do you guys think about this? Is there anything else you notice about how details are used here that kind of struck you?
The verbs are strong.
The verbs are strong. They really are. Like you can think about like paddled, whistled, waved, plotted. Like it's not. It's like a word that does a couple things at once, right? Like it literally has an action happen, so like a scene moving forward, and because of the verb choice, we get the detail, we get the specificity of how it's happening, we get the feeling behind it. If we're building out the story of the world, and we're also learning something about the inner world, like what is it? You can see some of his mood by how his plot, the fact that he's plotting as opposed to running up the hill or walking briskly or dancing. Like the verb you choose, like evokes, is a really handy way to give something show both the outer world and the inner world at once. That's a good point. Anything else particular interesting? I'll note, I think the name of the dog, Doubletree Mutt's pretty cool. I think that evokes a lot.
Crow Congress actually mean? So A, not being limited, because like the word would be murder, like a murder of crows, but is choosing actively not to use a murder of crows, because it can have different connotations
Exactly. That, like, I love that. I love that. Like, yeah. I mean, I feel like when people come, the group of animals work terms. Everybody loves the crow one for its weirdness, you know. But yeah, that's like. But there's an active choice to choose a word that evokes a different meaning. That like keeps things on the sound. That has a different moods and connotations. And yeah, I love like that. Like yeah, the attention to language kind of very subtly evoking the very sounds that it is describing, right? It's doing two things at once. Excellent. Okay, so that's a really fun one. This is also kind of as a point of amplification. There's like this just to cite our friend Chekhov. He was writing a letter about details to someone. As he put it, when describing nature, a writer should seize upon small details, arranging them so that the reader will see an image in his mind after he closes his eyes. For instance, you will capture the truth of a moonlit night if you write that a gleam like starlight shone from the pieces of a broken bottle and the dark, plump shadow of a dog or a wolf appeared. One of the things he was trying to make a point in this letter is too, is like, you know, nature, you know, there's different ways to like engage with nature. Call back to your lecture less residency, but like seeing it like through the eyes of this like human element is like can be a particularly evocative way when we're telling stories about people. Though at the same time I note that one of the things I like about the Crow Congress at the end there is it just shows that there's multiple worlds happening at the same time. There's a kind of simultaneity. He's part of it, but it's not his world, right? You know, he's just of it. And meanwhile, like there's all these other important discussions and matterings and movements happening. Okay, so that was I'm going to move on to the next one. So one of the things too, like the shift in this example is that it's not a narrative moment, it's not a scene, but nonetheless there's quite a lot of details used. And we can talk more about how it is. This is from the opening of Chanel Miller's Know My Name, a first-person memoir. That's super good. Everybody should read. And I'm just going to read this too. These are her first words. I am shy. In elementary school, for a play about a safari, everyone else was an animal. I was grass. I've never asked a question in a large lecture hall. You can find me hidden in the corner of any exercise class. I'll apologize if you bump into me. I'll accept every pamphlet you hand out on the street. I've always rolled my shopping cart back to its place of origin. If there's no more half and half on the counter at the coffee shop, I'll drink my coffee black. If I sleep over, the blankets will look like they've never been touched. I've never thrown my own birthday party. I'll put on 3 sweaters before I ask you to turn on the heat. I'm okay with losing board games. I stuff my coins haphazardly into my purse to avoid holding up the checkout line. When I was little, I wanted to grow up and become a mascot so I have the freedom to dance without being seen. I was the only elementary school student to be elected as a conflict manager 2 years in a row. My job was to wear a green vest every recess, patrolling the playground. If anyone had an unsolvable dispute, they'd find me and I'd teach them about I messages, such as I feel when you. Once a kindergartner approached me, said everyone got 10 seconds on the tire swing, but when she swung, kids counted 1 cat, 2 cat, 3 cat, and when the boys swung, they counted 1 hippopotamus, 2 hippopotamus, longer turns. I declared from that day forward, everyone would count 1 tiger, 2 tiger. My whole life, I've counted in tigers. So different, right? It's a completely different mode, completely different vibe, but a ton of details. And one thing I think that's interesting here, though I'm very curious what you guys think too, so I'm going to ask in just a moment, is how there's a 3-word opening sentence and everything else is kind of justifying it. It's giving the details that show that sentence in action. They're kind of micro scenes, right? Like they're little mini glimpses, but scarcely, I don't think any one is more than a sentence. And there's a choice here to give not just one example, but another, and another, and another. and another, and another, and another. And like the listing of this, the listing technique, the listing of details creates, well, what is its effect? What do you think its effect? What do you think about that choice to illustrate her shyness, not just with maybe one or two details, but to go on for a number of paragraphs? Why would you do that? Yeah.
Showing us the significance of being like this is anticipating that what we read following this is going to show that some dilemma or some conflict occurs where this will be challenged.
Yeah, like it's kind of underscoring that this isn't just an ornament on her personality. It's like there's a reason why this matters. It's emphasis, right? By like giving like detail upon detail upon detail. It's a way of just like, this is important. This is an important piece of information. We, especially given that this is the opening of this book, it suggests that this is going to play a part. This is the characteristic that's going to play a part in the events that unfold, right? The story that she's telling. And does anybody have any other thoughts? Yeah, right.
You know, it's repetition, and it's repetition that raises the intensity of it each time.
Yeah.
It's like a jewel. Every time she turns it, you get another angle, like from the very same jewel. It's just like this angle, that angle. It builds upon itself and reinforces itself.
That is beautifully put. That's a beautiful image. I love that turning jewel. And yeah, that's right. It's like it builds emphasis by listing, but it's not making the same thing again and again. You see the things in different ways. Just real quick, little glimpses of light. So it and thus like the intensity of it escalates. So by the end, by the time we get her to my whole life I've counted in tigers, you know like you feel that it's like, oh well, lots of people are shy. You know what I mean? But like you feel like we've hit a moment. There's some tension that's actually built. I saw Matthew and then Whitney. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you've been talking about like details doing like double work and things like that, and this is so interesting. So not only do we find out all of these micro details about this narrator's personality, but we also find out that from the present position, with this reflective distance, this is the sort of character who is compelled to take inventory of her own personality in order to try and make sense out of something, like why am I the way I am, and like breaking it down to the minutiae. So
Yeah.
like it does that double work, which is really
Yeah, she's searching for her own patterns. You know, like she's searching for her own patterns, like remembering all these other instances and searching for this like common thread and how it yeah, this is part of like how there's like a tension building. Some of the suspense is, why does this matter? Like, where does this go? Why is this something that led her to this point of like seeking to take inventory of her life, of these events of her life, seemingly modest events that added up to some larger, just something larger. Yeah, but
I was going to say something very similar to what Matthew said, in that in doing this, it's basically reinforcing this shy person who feels like they're never seen. It would have to overstate everything because they're not seen and they're not used to being heard. And so it's a natural almost anxiety of this character to overstate everything, because you don't exist in a world where, you know, you feel like you're seen and it's part of your personality and your choice, but it's true all the same.
yeah, think of the title, like that we're opening the book with, right? Like there is a kind of like, yeah, like an insisting upon presence, you know, like despite, you know, playing grass in the school play, despite like hurrying out of the checkout line with coins like are falling back behind you because you don't want to disrupt anyone, despite the like sort of, it's like this is part of the interesting tension, is like the insisting on presence in this writing, even as what's being described are ways of hiding. So yeah.
Oh, yeah, so building on that, I think one of the things interesting with details is association. In fact, she chooses time is so interesting.
That's a point of revelation, right? Like what does it say about what does it say? Like, you know, there's the cat counts and the hippopotamus counts, and she picks tiger. What does that suggest?
What does it suggest?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it suggests, you know, like power and anger, and, you know, like what are tigers? They're powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a desire to be powerful.
And also, like, just this is because she was describing this sort of conflict resolution technique. It's like, you know, this syllabically, you know, she's trying to like mediate between these two, like for ultimate fairness. I think it's like kind of revealing some of the, but like, but you know, there's plenty of two-syllable words, and that's an interesting one to choose, right? Yeah, Joy.
It feels like there's a little bit of a loop happening, like reinforcing itself. Like, here's some evidence that shows that I am shy. And out of my shyness, I do this. And that is then evidence that I am shy. And because I'm shy, I do this. So this is sort of the rhythm of her life, at least at the beginning.
Yeah, the rhythm, like, yeah, this is like, I think, I appreciate that, like, kind of looping quality. It's like, you know, by several paragraphs on, we haven't forgotten where we begun, you know, because we're kind of circling around the same idea, even as this is nonetheless moving forward, if not in scene or plot, just because of the escalating, like, kind of emphasis and tension and the sort of, like, suggestiveness of, like, something happening. But it's kind of like if I drew a picture of it, it would be this like kind of spiraling circle a little bit, you know, looping even as it sort of progresses. Yeah.
Just the variety too of sentence structure, types of examples, and details that are given, keep it from getting boring. That but even though they're very detailed, they're also all tied in on one specific organizing principle for them. So it's really effective. And like you were asking, like, what is having all these different small pinpoints kind of do? It ends up creating a sketch. It's like each one of these lines is like another little line in drawing a portrait of somebody.
Drawing this picture. Yeah, I appreciate that you mentioned that too, because there's a different version of this opening where you wrote a few paragraphs and just talked about being shy for like 3 paragraphs, and by the end of it, the reader might be like, I get it. Like, okay, you know what I mean? Like I'm a little, it can be off-putting rather than inviting. And yeah, just literally the craft techniques of giving us very different scenes, you know, like varying the images, moving quickly from one to the next, sentence by sentence. Crafting the sentences differently, and they get a little bit more complex, a little more depth to them as we go on too. You know, like if anyone had an unsolvable dispute, they find me. You know, there's a little bit more there than I'll apologize if you bump into me. You know, like it's sort of like there's just a touch more detail. Yeah, Bob.
That line, my whole life I've counted the tigers.
It's a great line.
Like, look at the word intimacy. Like, there's a whole worldview packed in.
And we carry that forward, right? Like we carry that into the rest of the story, and it's earned. You know, like it doesn't just leave us hanging there. Like as we find. Good news, guys. We're gonna read more Chanel Miller. And notice how this next paragraph. I mean, this is kind of it has sort of a similar setup in that the first line is the articulation and the rest are details chosen. To this, here, let's see. Here we go. She's talking about her sister. Holding it together for her was what I'd been trained for. One time, she became ill on a plane, lurching forward, and I held out my hands to catch her vomit before it could hit her lap. When my grandma crumbled blue cheese over our salads, Tiffany pinched her nose, and I'd wait for my grandma to turn around before shoveling her cheesy leaves into my mouth. After we watched E.T., she slept in my bed every night for the next 7 years, terrified of that dehydrated alien and its wrinkly finger. When people kissed in movies, I held a pillow in front of her face. Inappropriate, you're too young. I wrote and redrafted persuasive essays that convinced my parents to give us Nokia cell phones. At every class party, I'd wrap half of my donut or snickerdoodle in a napkin so I could deliver it to her at recess. When I loved horses, I tied her to a chair with a dog leash, called her Trinity, put a bath mat on her back like a saddle, brushed her hair, and made her eat Cheerios out of my hand. I still remember when my parents found her in her stable. If you want to play, you have to be the horse, my parents said. You sacrifice for her. You protect her from aliens. You eat the blue cheese. I understood that that was the first and most important job I had. Interesting, right? So think about like all the things we talked about in that first section. You can see a variation of it play out at this different moment in the book, right? You know, she states the thing that is important. She gives us these glimpses, these details that are embedded in these kind of tiny little narratives that evoke so much about this relationship between these two sisters, about her feeling about her role, her responsibility toward her sister in particular, her role in the family, how her relationship with her parents, you know, kind of calling back to the drawing on details that come from multiple dimensions, you know, multi-sensory stuff. This is you can see versions of that play out here too, right? There's voices, there's the Cheerios in the hand, there's the bath mat on the back, there's the dehydrated finger, there's where the details are coming from different directions, I guess, you know, so we feel even as we're moving quickly and we don't stay too long in any of these moments, the evocative pieces are the details are enough to say the story, right? The details are what's telling us the story. And just as we said before too, there's this choice of the artful abundance of them. There's a craft choice in the listing of this, the points of emphasis, the building of tension. And by the time, similarly to that other section, from first line to last line, you know, we're in a different place, even as it's the last line is emphasizing the first point. I am shy, my whole life I've counted in tigers. By going the journey in between, we feel that last line more. Here, holding it together for her was what I've been trained for. I understand that that was the first and most important job I had. You know, there's even though we're not in scene, with the first example, the story is moving a little bit. Right? By the time we get to the end of the paragraph, we've moved a little further in our knowledge and understanding of these people in the story. Does anybody notice anything else about that section? Yeah.
I noticed, so all of the things she mentions are sticky smells. And even the Cheerios, they're not honey nut Cheerios, they're Cheerios. And but they're all, Worsley, blue cheese, I mean, they all have that, they're sticky.
That's a really interesting connection that I hadn't thought of, but I kind of love that. I love the noticing of that.
That has nothing to do with the story, and why she chose sticky smells, but.
I mean, I hadn't thought of it, but just off the top of my head, I kind of love how that kind of evokes the very particular intimacies among family. Perhaps in itself is a little bit of a point of tension. I mean, this sisterly relationship is very close, but it's also, you know, it's a lot to feel like your first and most important job is to parent your sister, you know? Yeah.
There's an undercurrent in the beginning and middle of indicating how unfair this was. A tone that suggests I was responsible for this as a child, and then it really comes to fruition at the end, when she's trying to be a child and is told directly, "This is not your job.
Yeah.
Your job is to
Yeah. You be the horse. Yeah.
To
That's-
observation, I think that the sneakiness is maybe really conscious, especially if we're building this idea of her being a parent, and just all of the sticky things, and repulsive and disgusting things that a parent has to put up with and does so
Yeah.
pretends very.
So it kind of evokes that.
Gross to everyone else around them.
It evokes that, but she, the narrator, writing in her more present, reflective state, knows that there's an off tension, much as she loves her sister, and so that, so you can feel that, maybe that some of that stickiness too is a way of kind of showing the feeling, right? The inward feeling towards this particular role. Like it's just like, ugh, you know, a little bit of a little revulsion, you know, at some of this dynamic. The other thing I just wanted to if it's not evident, I just want to be clear. Like sometimes I think when people use details, they assume we mean images, you know, and sometimes that's very true. Concrete images, sensory images. But one of the things I was kind of like, I hope these examples kind of illustrate is that like details come in many forms, and it's not just description, right? Like it's not just description. It's the particulars of this world and the characters and the events, etc., and their movements. It's the particulars of it, the specifics of it, that in their telling, in the craft of it, in how they're told, reveal like our portals of revelation, right? They keep us grounded in the story, and they also tell the story. Okay, finally, just the last bit at the end before we move on to another writer. This is the piece. The reason I tagged on this bit about our parents at the end is because I think this is also an interesting example of writing, like how details are still a resource when you're writing around a blank spot, when there's a lot you don't know. Like she knows her sister really well, she knows her shyness really well, she knows her dynamic, but there's some things she doesn't know about her parents. And so this is just a tiny little glimpse at a way of using details to nonetheless write towards that, to make that blankness felt. She writes, "My dad is a retired therapist who had worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, listening to people. All the money that has housed and fed us comes from guiding people through stories we will never hear. My mom is a writer who has authored 4 books in Chinese, which means her books are ones I cannot yet read. As open as my parents are, much of their lives are unknowable to me." So she kind of says it quite literally. She speaks directly to the blank spots, you know, of what she doesn't know about her parents. But she illustrates it, you know, with these like a well-chosen detail for both of them that evoke a kind of how like enormous parts of their life are completely inaccessible to her, you know, completely inaccessible to her. She can't read it, she can't hear the stories her dad hears in therapy, like she doesn't know. And I think that way of using the details makes it more effective than if she had just given us this last line, right? You know, which is another version of the story. We just say that last line, you kind of move on to the next moment. Did anybody have anything else they'd like to add about Chanel Miller before we shift? Maddie and then Joey.
I was going to say it's interesting. I kind of want to go back to something Leslie said, which is it's interesting that the whole thing is about her doing things that people don't notice. And then the moment somebody notices something, she gets chastised for it. And then her relationship with her parents is defined by all the things that she can't notice. It's just this weird dichotomy of just being almost invisible, but still like brilliantly describing what that invisibility looks like, and making it really vivid. It's just.
I love how you're seeing the connection, like some connections between the three. Yeah, like chronicling this kind of like invisibility, and yeah, and just like thus really adding to the intensity of this moment of really asserting herself in this bold, childlike, imaginative way, and being pushed back for it. Yeah, I think all that other context makes that like detail, the meaning of it is much more significant to us because of what else we've read in this, you know, and circling into that, like how her understanding of her parents, super interesting. Yeah, this core idea of invisibility, being seen and unseen, you know, the whole book kind of orients around that in so many ways.
I just found this last paragraph interesting because it's only a few sentences, and the author conveys this idea that she knows exactly what her parents do while also not knowing anything about what her parents do.
Like, so the tension between the precision and the complete unfathomable unknown.
Yeah, I just find that really interesting.
Yeah, it's a good observation. It is interesting. Yeah, and then you see that kind of built upon as the story goes forward. Yay. Okay, other book, The Inner Coast. Donovan Hahn. This is, he lives in Ann Arbor. He teaches in Detroit. This is a book of essays that came out last year, mostly Great Lakes oriented. This is from an essay called A Romance of Rust, where he really like immersed himself in, as some in this room would appreciate, the hyper-obsessive world of historic tool collecting. Okay, so I'm just gonna read this and we'll come back to it. So, this is the opening. If a few years ago you had asked me what I thought of tool collecting, I would have told you that it sounded like the sort of sentimental pastime pursued mainly by men with soft minds, thick wallets, and lonely wives. In New York, where I lived at the time, one sometimes encountered woodworking tools and farming implements on the walls of pastorally themed restaurants, serving expensive comfort food, or among handmade quilts and kerosene lanterns in the windows of West Village boutiques. I considered such Americana to be so much nostalgic gimcrack. The inflated prices old tools commanded I attributed to the ambient dissatisfaction with modernity. The more expendable we felt in our jobs, the more complicated and computerized our lives became, the more hardware made of metal and wood seemed to symbolize all that we had lost, we Americans, but especially we American men. Until recently in America, manliness was proportionate to handiness. The ancient Greeks had Achilles and his shield. The British had Arthur and Excalibur. We had John Henry and his hammer, Paul Bunyan and his axe, Queequeg and his manly harpoon. Our national poets sang hymns to the broad axe and the village blacksmith. Our prophets didn't merely wander in the wilderness, they built cabins there. The adzes and bow saws with which anxiety beset urban professionals now equip their apartments originally belonged to self-reliant, self-employed, self-made yeomen and artisans, or so the traffickers in nostalgia wished us to believe. It was a lie, I knew, this Luddite fantasy of this artisanal golden age, and so the essay goes forth. So, a few things I noticed here, and then of course I'm interested in what you think. One of the things I think is interesting is that this is kind of a realm of like reflective detail, right? Like he's sort of like he's in his head, you know? He's speculating, he's wondering. He's like, there are details that like touch on like the real world, like the restaurants in the West Village and boutiques and so forth. But he's beginning this essay with a sort of, with exposition, with a kind of like detailed, rich thinking through, you know, that builds us to some of the core questions of it. Like you know, it goes on to be like a pretty like concrete profile of a particular collector and this whole world, and we get into like the scenes and the narrative, and you know, we kind of walk through this. But I thought it was an interesting choice to like open this way, and to use details to not just describe, but to you know, deepen the story with this sort of you know, curated and specific reflectiveness. We learn a lot about the narrator, right? We learn where he begins when he enters, as he's about to enter this feverish world of fandom. And he gives us a little bit of a sense of like history and stakes when he starts introducing this to us. What else do folks notice? And one thing, as with you do, like with the essays that you write, you know, when you're kind of like thinking about things, it's you know, you can just start like sometimes with a kind of annotation, like where are the details here? Like why this detail and not this detail? Like what counts as a detail in this particular excerpt? Yeah, Joy.
5 different specific examples are given in succession, and they're all mythological or fictitious, and I think that really plays up the romance of the idea and pursuit of this. And only the 5th one gets the descriptive adjective manly.
Yeah, that's a great observation. So kind of like Chanel Miller, there's a listing technique, just in a different form here. The ancient Greeks had Achilles and his shield. The British had Arthur and Excalibur. We had John Henry and his hammer. Paul Bunyan and his axe. Queequeg and his manly harpoon. So there's a list here that is like in that kind of inventory to borrow the world. There's this we're evoking tools as symbols of this romantic world, as opposed to tools being like what literally built this house. Yeah.
I'm thinking of Cohen's Old Chestnut, reading this and that. And I mean, just the detail of like John Henry with his hammer, it tells us about the person. Like that detail intimately linked to their identity.
Yeah, that's right. Like, and this is like the kind of tying it to that, like these mythic ideas, like he's introducing us not just to the myths themselves, and it's not just the person and their and an ornament. It's the tool is what made the myth. It was the heart of the story. It was this identity, which is of course the fuel behind a lot of this, a lot of identity. A lot of these people are chasing after, in this like subculture he's about to like live in for a little while with all its weirdness and contradictions. Do you folks have other thoughts about this section? Yeah, Leslie.
He establishes a
Point of view.
Right from the beginning, that he's looking at critical eye.
Mm-hmm.
And this section in particular, he's building up, the nostalgia. Here's some examples of, here are the mythologies these are based on, and then that line that you end this excerpt, which the syntax she used, it was a lie, I think. So we're building up to that moment where he stops and reflects, okay, what does this mean to me?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just told blankly, just,
Mhm.
as an observation.
Mm-hmm.
Complete. He's invested in this.
Yeah, it's interesting because he begins, as he said, that he's establishing this point of view really effectively which is great for the beginning of an essay. He's establishing this point of view by he's characterizing himself first as an outsider, right? I lived in New York at the time. I mainly saw these things just hanging on walls. Like, here's what I thought about it. Here's what here's my theory, on this. The more expendable we felt in our jobs, here's what I think, here's my point of view. And then he sort of expands from this tools as decoration. He expands on this to the romance and mythic realm. And there is you can see this turn. It just kind of goes forth and narrating it, and then there is that turn of or so the traffickers in nostalgia wished us to believe. So he's kind of established himself as not one of those, which is sort of emphasized with this next line. And I knew is pretty, I feel like that's a pretty significant phrase to put in anything. What's known is the person, one of the things we might wonder is how that knowledge is either amplified or complicated in the essay to come as he gets closer and closer to this world. He's observing this world. It's mythic and weird realms. This kind of faux nostalgia for this that people put so much of their identity on. And how is that knowledge going to come up and bump up against this world when he gets real close to people who believe it, and who are in it and who love it, and we're putting fortunes, behind some weird 16th century buzz saw. I don't know. Okay, yeah.
When you talked about before, details can give us an inner world and an outer world at once. And I feel like one of the things that comes about in this inner world is he uses the word wilderness and then he uses the word urban. And when he talks about the urban, the hyphenated word is anxiety beset. But then when he's referring, to the wilderness a few lines later, he says self-reliant, self-employed, self-made, and it's just you're almost getting this glimpse of to him, the wilderness version of everything was maybe what he appreciates more, thinks is right, maybe. And then the urban side of it, he's like having a negative connotation.
I love that you're like looking like specific words to see like what he's choosing, the contrast between like kind of this like urban and country, you know, like bit, which he established himself as like part of like the New York world at the time, and it does introduce a kind of tension, because even though he's articulating this as like this kind of faux nostalgia, you know, that it seems that he's like he's like has a judgment on, you know, right? It was a lie, you know, like we do learn something about the narrator just by the fact that they are nonetheless going forward into it. What are they looking for? You know, like there's a we in here too, like we Americans, but we especially Americans, like does he have some kind of conflict within his own soul that he's trying to like reconcile here, in immersing himself in this kind of faux nostalgia that he begins with like some of these like kind of cutting remarks. Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, we're gonna keep going. Now, the thing that I think is really interesting about, this is a memoir, The Yellow House, Sarah Broom, her family, New Orleans house. Super good. One of the things I kind of like about this last example, and this isn't like any kind of hierarchy, these are just like different examples, but one of the things that's interesting about this last one is I think it like brings together a lot of these different elements, these different ways of using details, like using it, like in this section, there's both like details used both in scene and out of scene. There's details that are used to deepen character, to move plot forward. There's the kind of artful abundance, the sort of inventorying, the listing technique to like build emphasis and intensity. There's some of that reflective exposition, like, you know, kind of like the in your head way of like using details even when you're working in that kind of abstract realm, like stuff I think, stuff I'm wondering about. So we're just going to read this. There's it's a little bit edited just for space, so forgive me for it. And even though there's various characters named, you get the gist. When I am 10, my mother discovers that I cannot see beyond a hand in front of my eyes. I have been acting a clown in school to distract from this non-sight. The children sitting all around me are annoying blurs, the chalkboard black waters with scratches of white. Sometimes if I slant my head the way Elvin had instructed for that kiss, close one eye and peer out the side of the open eye, I think I can see better. I love desk assignments because I can bend close into this paper to work silently. But most of our lessons require looking at the teacher and the chalkboard in front of the classroom, which forces me to act out to hide the truth. This is why I get an X instead of a check for exercise of self-control on my report card that year. If the teacher asks a question based on something she's written on the board, I'll say something smart-alecky to hide the fact that I have no idea what she's written. It's hard to know that you cannot see. The teacher finally guesses something is wrong. Maybe she can see my contorting face and moves me to the front row where even while squinting my eyes into slits, I still cannot make anything out. I am not legally blind, but nearly. What's the difference when you can't see? Mom and I drive together in the Banana Aries across the high rise and into town, which is what Mom calls anything resembling the New Orleans that most people understand. Uptown, downtown, the French Quarter, those places nearer to where she grew up. We park on the gravel and walk the short distance to a storefront on Claiborne Avenue. The shop that contains the eyeglasses that would make me see is lit up with cold fluorescent bulbs. All the buildings where we go for physical wellness have this dull quality. Plastic and metal frames glow from behind like crown jewels, rows and rows of them. My eyes are examined, and I am directed to choose one of the ugly frames in the much smaller section offered to children with broken eyes who can't afford decent-looking glasses. Scene goes forth, she comes out, her first thing, like for many of us who first get glasses, is like, trees have leaves. And then she goes forward and she just can't stop, just like, this, I see this, I see this, I see this, you know. I annoy everyone around me by observing out loud what everyone already knows. I read the label on the bathroom sink and the covers of cassette tapes. There is the Abramson High School sticker in the window of Lynette's in my room that before was a smear of blue and white on a glass pane. I can see detailed versions of everyone I thought I already knew. This is her school. They walk home from Jefferson Davis, changes. I see the scantily clad women walking Chef Mentor Highway as Elvin and I wait for the light to change. How Elvin walks now with the older boys and the switching girls, leaving me behind. Now, waiting at the light to cross over to the short end of Wilson after the school day, I can see Carl in the distance, milling outside our house, can see him looking in my direction and waving a hand. Every night, I hide the purple glasses underneath my pillow while I sleep. During the night, they change position so that when I wake, I beat the mattress frantically in search of them. Only when they are on my face can I know what kind of day I have awakened to. By the end of my 10th year, my first year of 20/20 eyesight, one detail overwhelms them all. Our side of Wilson Avenue, the short end, seems a no-banner place where police cars routinely park, women's heads bobbing up and down in the driver's seat. I am struck with the wonder of this, how we live in a city where police take such peculiar coffee breaks. Walking home from school, I try not to see what is right in front of my face. Sometimes, when I want the world to go blurry again, I remove my glasses when passing by these scenes. In this way, I learn to see and to go blind at will. So, what's going on here? How is detail used in this section? Another way to ask the question is what detail, well, first of all, maybe just start, what details stand out to you, in this kind of section? What particulars that build out the outer world and the inner world are evident?
Well, we learn where she is when she talks about her mom referring to town and what town means to her mom.
Mhm.
We know exactly where we're at.
Yeah, there's actually, and this is appropriate for a book with a place-based title where place is very specific. There's a lot of place-oriented details here, right? Where there's certainly what you're saying about the understanding of what town is, which is kind of chronicled, in a fair bit of follow-up details there. There's even just naming things like the street names, like the storefront on Claiborne Avenue, like the house on Wilson Avenue later on. Like there's the walking, the walk home, from school, the highway. There's a lot of there's a lot of concrete details in place, and kind of like the trees in the John Steinbeck thing, sometimes just calling things by their name, like the name of the highway, the name of the school. There's stories embedded in the specific names, even if we don't know everything yet, even if we don't have the whole package.
I find it really interesting the use of C.
C.
Because in that first paragraph, the walk home from Jefferson Davis changes. I see the scantily clad women, and then she kind of backtracks and it talks about not having the glasses. So it very much feels like all of these details are directly related to what she is seeing, and there's a focus on those glasses. Because then it goes back again at the very end. I remove my glasses when passing by these scenes. In this way, I learn to see and go blind at will. So there's almost like this conscious recognition of a juxtaposition between what she can see with her glasses on and what the world is like without her glasses.
See, this is really interesting because I pointed to that paragraph because that is kind of where a turn happens, and maybe I should have just put the whole thing on there, but I was typing it. It was, but yeah, we begin, if you kind of break it down, we begin this section with the sort of the first two paragraphs are sort of a detail-rich kind of chronicle of not seeing, right? The chalkboard black waters with scratches of white. I'm squinting, I'm turning red. There's some consequences here. There's multi-dimensional detail in that we You know, we have, you know, like the feedback she's getting from others, you know, like from like her teacher. There's, what is the difference when you can't see? She's acting out. Okay, so there's a problem here. Then the next paragraph, we kind of get into the search for the solution, right? Like we're going to get glasses. Here's, you know, using that as an opportunity to also like orient us in place in a different way. She sees these like various tools. We learned something about the class of the speaker's family, you know, with what kind of glasses they're directed towards. There's also the, you know, like I love the observation about how all the buildings we go for physical wellness have this like dull, kind of depressed quality. They do, like and you know, many of them, you know, like which, I think that's a good observation. And then the story moves into this like kind of ecstasy of seeing, right? Like she's just, so like just in a way that the storytelling, the medium of the message, the storytelling matches the experience. There's like, it's actually quite like a much longer thing of like, I see this, I'm reading this, I'm annoying all my friends by just like seeing everything, and it's so wonderful. And here's all these different things I'm seeing. And that paragraph is kind of the one where things turn. We start seeing things where like, oh, you know, like this is like, you know, somebody I was close with is now walking with other people. Now I see somebody way over there, and they just give me a wave. I don't, you know, kind of come over, you know, like it starts, and then we get into like the, you know, I'm hiding, like my panic, you know, in the morning from going from seeing not seeing. It starts fracturing a little bit. She starts realizing that, of course, like not everything that she can now see is great, and some of it's actually quite painful and disorienting, and that so our story is moving forward in a number of different ways, and the tension is escalating. So when we go on, we carry on, we're bringing that knowledge with us. Yeah, Leslie.
I think it's important to note that the narrative distance is much, the perspective is much closer to the first person, especially compared to the previous example. And the description is in some way in a reenactment of this childhood experience. Not just noting the chalkboard, blackboard, scratch board, kind of giving us insight into the eyes of the child and getting us close to that. I wouldn't say all the way, but closer, a closer version.
Yeah, that's really important to think about too when we're talking about like memoir, right? Like the you of today, the Sarah Broom of today, knows a lot that her 10-year-old self didn't know. And there's different ways, good way, different, you know, there's good options. You often have multiple options, good options to tell a story. You can tell, like one way is this like very retrospective narrative where like that consciousness of the present filters everything. And you have a lot of advantages with that perspective, because then you can pull on all the details you know, the understanding, the nuance and all that. Another choice is to get, you know, much closer and to try, like reenact in some ways the scene that follows in a way that mimics what the knowledge and lack of knowledge like you had at that particular time. So the child narrative here doesn't understand everything that she's seen, but she does have a reaction to it, and knows enough to try to like look away. The Sarah Broom of the present day, I'm sure, would have a lot more to say, you know, about all the whole dynamics. But we're not there yet. The story, like right now, we're with her at 10. We can get to that if we do. Like we can get to that, you know, you can bring forth that, like, you know, the developing understanding later in the book. That's your movement. That's your plot in many ways. Yeah, that's a good observation. Anything else that's struck people with this excerpt? Okay, just before we we can like do some questions and stuff too, but like one other thing I kind of wanted to mention, because this came up in our workshop too, like, you know, like there's like some of the tools you can use to like find details. This is like sometimes like one of the challenges is if you weren't there, like if you didn't know, if you can't remember everything, if you like, what do you do? Like how do you summon the details? If you're like, okay, I want to make this scene vivid, evocative. I want to draw from the multi-sensoriness. I want to use specific names of specific trees that were there. I want to like, you know, remember some of the voices. I want to remember what, you know, like that'd be cool to have whatever the teacher wrote on the report card, but I don't actually remember. You know, what can you do, especially if you're working in the realm of nonfiction? Like, how do you summon details? But not just nonfiction, fiction too. Like, maybe you're writing something like Kurt, like set in World War II. You know, she wasn't there. Like, how do you find some of the real vivid details that make it possible to have a scene? I'm just gonna. This is not a complete list, but I'm just gonna give some of the standard tools that I've used at least. So the one we were talking about like over the last couple days was like how simple and yet effective it is to bring forth weather. There is a tool, it's called Weather Underground. Interesting. It's wunderground.com, and you can just plug in any place and any date, and it gives you the full weather information. So like just like how it evolved during the day, you can even like look up a specific time. There was rain in the morning, it was clear by night. It's so simple. It's such a simple way to like build out the sensory experience of any particular moment in your scene and calling back to like the weather. You can, other details you can find through like a lot of basic research tools is of course like, you know, like you can go back to the materials, right? Like whether it's personal or outwardly. You can like go find your old report cards perhaps. You can like look through archival images. You can find archival videos. You can read letters, texts, postcards. You can like, your libraries can be like great tools if you're like reconstructing like a historical scene. You can use it, you can draw from like what other writers have filtered for you and kind of use that as a roadmap to like look back. You can interview people. You can, who were there at the time, including your own family members sometimes, or whoever else, if it's a personal story. You can go back to people and say, hey, you were also there that day. What do you remember? Tell me the story. Even though, you know, so you're not just relying on perhaps your own memories to reconstruct a scene. They may remember something you didn't remember. They may contradict you. And like that might be an interesting thing to like, you know, note directly in some way. You can, one thing I remember doing, I was doing this for an article where I was having a narrative opening about something that happened in November 1997, and I was just trying to like get back into the space. I'm like, what was going on in November 1997? So I was just starting like going on YouTube. I was just like looking at commercials. I was just like looking at commercials like that was like playing out. I knew the person like worked at Burger King. She was 17 years old. She worked at Burger King. So I was just watching a lot of Burger King commercials just to get the feeling of it. And one of the things that was coming up was like they were promoting their like Toy Story puppets, you know, like order this and get some Toy Story puppets. And so I went back to her and I was like, hey, do you remember like these like Toy Story things? And she's like, oh yeah. And so great, I can like bring some like I can add this detail into the scene of how she was like, you know, like handing out these little like Woody the Cowboy dolls, you know, in this to help me construct this scene of her innocent world before like, you know, things happen, right? It's like it was so you can just some of this I think is just like poking around, you know, like looking through whatever trunk you can look at to find whatever you can find. And anytime you come across something that feels specific and has some of that like might have some of that evocative feeling behind it, these are the details you can rely on. I want to like, and you can also at the same time, I will like have a little bit of caution about like about kind of getting lost in this. Like I do sometimes think the research element can be a way of hiding, you know, like with our work, you know, like ever looking for more details, ever looking for more facts, ever looking for more stories. In my experience, sometimes I'm like, well, I could just, you know, there's always more people to talk to. There's always more people to talk to again. There's like, you know, like, you know, there's always more to do. And like, and so it's cultivating some kind of self-awareness of when you're like actively seeking the details that are going to make your story come alive and propel it forward, and when you're using them to stagnate. You know what I mean? Like when they're like kind of an excuse to tell your, you know, hide from, you know, to hide from your own work. You know, I just want to put that out there because I noticed that in myself, and I think that can be a challenge sometimes. You can see this on pages sometimes too. Sometimes like detail, to detail. The story never moves forward. You know, like sometimes it's evident in the text, not only in practice. And I don't know. That's kind of all I have to say. You know, like yeah.
I'll add, if you're writing like really personal stuff and you're not a journaler, and you do use social media, like Facebook, you can pick the years and the month and the days you want to go back to. And if you ever wrote like statuses or things on Twitter, like even just that sentence can help you remember something. Like, oh yeah, I wrote this really weird thing because that happened. Like I did a lot of obscure, like I'm gonna post this music video because this is how I'm feeling. And so those tools can like take you back really well too, and like they make it really easy to search everything and your relationship between people. You can pick another person and see everything you ever said to each other. It's wild.
Old text messages, you know, can be like, you know, pretty intense. Listening to music like that, like, you know, like sometimes watching, like if you're writing a story set in 1984, you know, just like live in 1984. Like watch the movies, like watch the television shows, listen to the music, the culture. Like it might jog more than you think. You might notice things that are worth like summoning in some way. You can reconstruct scenes, like reenact them in some ways to a certain extent. Like I feel like I might have told the story in the last residency, but it's one of my favorite like writerly techniques. It's Robert Caro, who wrote The Power Broker and this like kind of like 5-part thing about Lyndon Johnson. And as he puts it, I'm not writing biographies of powerful people, I'm writing biographies of power. And he has a very interesting project. But anyway, one of the scene he was trying to construct, and he never had a chance to actually talk to his main character, right? He's reconstructing so much. So he wanted to get to the moment where Lyndon Johnson, you know, comes from this like, you know, super poor, like hill country of Texas, weird family dynamics. He has his first job in Washington as like a congressional aide. It's like his first time in Washington. Him and some other guys like are at some like boarding house or whatever, and they like, you know, they would like go to work in the morning, like early in the morning. And as he interviewed people who were there, like one of the details that stayed in his mind that they kept coming up amongst several different folks was that they remember this like tall, gangly, kind of awkward guy, just like running to work, like he had this like weird gait, you know, like he would just like run, like in his suit and stuff, like running thing, and it just stayed in his mind because he's like, you know, interesting, you know, he's like very interesting, vivid, specific detail. He could plug that into his narrative, and you know, it's a much more compelling scene. But he was curious too about what does this reveal about the inner world? Like, what is going on here with this guy? And just out of curiosity, he like goes one morning. He himself like kind of goes back to like where this like boarding house was, and he just kind of does the walk. You know, he's like, I'm just going to follow his path at the same hour, you know, that he would have gone to work, just to see what he might have seen, you know, like kind of provoke it. And what he saw was this like glorious sunrise coming up behind the Capitol building, you know, this incredibly beautiful like image, and it was so striking to him because he's like, oh, that's what he's running toward, you know, it gave him this vision of power, this vision of like, you know, this like kind of like ecstatic, you know, mythic in some ways, like, you know, like manifestation of all of his ambitions, right? And so that now he had that other piece, even without talking to the guy, even without being there, he had that other piece that he could like fold into it, not just the vivid detail, but like how it reveals not the world and the inner world. And he did this not because he remembered it himself, not even because he could talk to the guy just told him. He did it by like just actually going there and reconstructing it. So sometimes, and doing this with your own life can be pretty powerful too. We all know this. Like if you go back to like your former elementary school, sometimes you're just like overwhelmed with the sensory memory of it, right? And when you're, I think this is like part of your writing process, you know? It is part of your writing process, not just like think through your memories, but to like, when possible, especially for the moments that have the most heat, the ones that you're really gonna build out, the ones that are points of emphasis, like just try to see if you can see what you can do to like reconstruct it, and see what you see now that you didn't see before. See what other people See what it shares about both the outer world and the inner world, like looking at that through that lens. It might give you just more rich material to give more texture and to your work that you wouldn't have known otherwise. And sometimes it's kind of a dud. Sometimes you're poking around and stuff and you're like, all right. Not much. And the other point too, we talked a little bit about like abundance of details, like those listing, things coming at it in different ways, escalating intensities. I also want to just acknowledge that there is like a purposeful strategy sometimes in the withholding of details, the scarcity, strategic scarcity of details, and thankful, like we got that in a previous lecture beautifully with Mary Ruffles like piece about the accident. There's a lot of key details that are never shared, but that in itself was a very purposeful choice, so just know that that's like a technique too. And it's more effective when it's clearly this like strategic choice, when we feel the energy of that, when it's as opposed to sort of like incidental detaillessness, which is when our writing often in draft mode is still kind of in this general abstract realm. That's not the same thing as with withholding of details, it's like a choice. So does anybody have any final questions or comments?